It begins in a room where the walls don't echo. A single desk. A map of a continent that looks too large for the paper it's printed on. Red dots that aren't cities but moments. A scientist who vanishes between an airport and a lobby. A warlord who becomes a police chief overnight. Plane that lands at dawn at a facility no one admits exists. Outside, the city hums as if none of it matters. Inside, decisions are made that never become speeches, the kinds of decisions that stop wars you never hear about and start ones that no one intends. It is a war without banners, fought in the intervals between headlines. And for 7 decades, the Central Intelligence Agency has run part of that war here, the silent contest for Africa. To understand this story, you have to let go of the poster version of espionage gadgets and trench coats and accept the version the professionals live. Its logistics and leverage, deniability, and time. Africa has always been a contest of maps. Colonial borders drawn by strangers, ideologies flown in from cold capitals, insurgencies homegrown in heat and hunger. Through it, all ran a second layer you could not see and were not meant to, covert operations that treated the continent as a chessboard with too many queens. The Cold War carved the grooves. The post-9/11 fight against jihadist networks followed those grooves and deepened them. And now, a new great power rivalry presses into the same spaces, quietly, insistently, without asking anyone's permission. Start at the beginning before satellite phones and drones, when decisions traveled by cable and ships still moved the world's plots. In 1960, the Congo shook itself free of a Belgian flag and tried to learn how to stand. Patrice Lumumba, a brilliant, volatile nationalist with a tragic clock, became prime minister and inherited a state built to be administered, not governed. The Belgian-backed secession of Katanga threatened to tear the country apart. The United Nations poured in blue helmets. The Soviets sniffed opportunity. Washington smelled a vacuum. In the capital, Leopoldville, the newly minted CIA station stared at a crisis wrapped in a man. Accounts that surfaced decades later paint a portrait almost too dramatic to be true. Plots to remove Lumumba through pressure, plots to kill him that ranged from lethal toxins to dirty alliances, and, finally, a de facto green light for forces closer to the ground that did the job in their own brutal fashion. Lumumba was seized and murdered in January 1961 by Congolese rivals with Belgian complicity. The CIA didn't pull the trigger. It didn't have to. The effect was the same. A few years later, Colonel Joseph Desire Mobutu, who had been Washington's choice for stability, ruled the Congo as Zaire, a bulwark against Moscow and a slow-motion catastrophe for its people. The lesson the agency took was one it would apply elsewhere. In a continent of fragile states, the fastest way to shape outcomes is to shape the person at the center. Across the continent in Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah tried to engineer an African future with state-led development and Pan-African ambition. He looked east and west and asked for help. On his own terms, a sin in a bipolar world. In 1966, his government fell in a coup. For decades, Ghanaians told each other the CIA did it. Scholars argue about the particulars. Archives whisper more than they speak. What remains is the pattern. When leaders moved too close to Moscow, or threatened Western strategic interests, or simply proved too independent, coups gained. Friends and enemies lost them. In Angola, the pattern exploded into full view. Portuguese colonial rule collapsed in 1974, and Angola's liberation movements MPLA, FNLA, UNITA turned their common victory into a civil war. The Soviets backed the Marxist MPLA. Cuba sent tens of thousands of troops. South Africa invaded from the south. And the CIA, through a program remembered by the codename IA, feature, pumped money and arms into the FNLA, and then UNITA, betting on Jonas Savimbi as a charismatic hammer against Soviet-Cuban expansion. It was a proxy war in the purest sense. The fighting lasted off and on for a quarter century. Each side called itself the defender against imperialism. Each side accepted help from faraway hands. Angola emerged from the fire with oil in the ground, mines under the ground, and ghosts on every street corner. In Langley, the operation was a victory you couldn't declare and a reminder of costs you couldn't count in press releases. Ethiopia taught different lessons. Under Haile Selassie, the United States built Kagnu Station. In Asmara, listening posts and dishes aimed at the sky and eastward at the Red Army, one of the crown jewels of Cold War signals intelligence. In 1974, the emperor fell. The Derg, a Marxist military committee under Mengistu Haile Mariam, took power and leaned on Moscow. Washington shifted to Somalia, supporting Syed Barre as an alternative. In the Ogaden War of 1977–78, Washington's friend became a loser, Moscow's client a victor, and the CIA learned once more that loyalties in the Horn of Africa move with the wind and that the wind is usually a storm. Libya lurked on the edge of many files. Muammar Gaddafi came to power in 1969 and made himself a global nuisance and a regional force. There were plots and counterplots. The United States bombed Tripoli and Benghazi in 1986 after a terror attack linked to Libyan agents. The CIA watched, listened, and played a long game of pressure and exposure that ended with Gaddafi surrendering his nuclear program in 2003. But North Africa is a different chapter. The Horn a different discipline. Somewhere between them lies Sudan, which hosted Al-Qaeda in the 1990s and later became a quiet and unlikely intelligence partner against the same network. The Africa desk learned to live with paradox because the continent refuses to be simple. The Cold War ended on maps and in speeches. It didn't end in files. In 1998, twin truck bombs exploded outside U.S. embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, killing more than 200. Al-Qaeda had arrived in Africa with a kind of violence that made the old playbooks look ceremonial. The CIA's mission pivoted in earnest. The silent war became a manhunt braided into statecraft. Camp Lemonnier in Djibouti, a dusty strip by a hot sea, became the forward base for a coalition of agencies and partners. The CIA joined Special Operations, NSA, and allied services in the work of a new era. Dismantle networks, preempt plots, and do it all through partners who could reach places Americans could not. Somalia, collapsed since 1991, was the proving ground. The agency funded an alliance of Mogadishu warlords in 2006 under the banner of counterterrorism. The Alliance for the Restoration of Peace and Counterterrorism worked on paper. On the ground, it helped trigger a backlash that brought the Islamic Courts Union to power. Ethiopia invaded with quiet American support. The ICU fractured. Al-Shabaab emerged the hardline splinter that pledged to Al-Qaeda and perfected the urban car bomb. The lesson was ancient and hard to learn. Covert action without political strategy breeds the very thing it fears. So the approach shifted slowly, imperfectly toward building Somali intelligence capacity. Reporting by major outlets in the 2010s described a CIA-mentored counterterror unit operating from the secure compounds at Mogadishu's airport. Advisors trained Somali officers. Targets were captured. Some were disappeared into a legal gray zone that human rights groups fought to illuminate. Kenyan and Ethiopian services cooperated in renditions and interrogations, alliances that saved lives and scarred reputations. Every file had two margins: operational gain on one side, moral cost on the other. Drone warfare made the margins bolder. From Djibouti, from a small island base in the Seychelles, from airfields in Ethiopia that later closed, pilots guided aircraft without pilots at ranges that used to belong to fiction. Some strikes carried Pentagon orders. Some carried CIA authority. Together they decapitated cells, disrupted plots, and created new debates about sovereignty, about civilian harm, about how you define a battlefield when the enemy does not wear a uniform or plant a flag. A generation of case officers learned to operate in a world where a meeting at noon could produce an effect at 1, halfway across a law. Kenya became an indispensable partner. Its anti-terror police units worked hand in glove with American counterparts. After the 2013 Westgate Mall attack and the 2019 Dusit D2 siege in Nairobi, coordination tightened further. Intelligence leads technical support the unglamorous craft of preventing the next bomb without humiliating the communities you need on your side. Critics accused Kenyan units of abuses. The CIA learned again that you can only control what you own, and on bad days not even that. Nigeria and the Lake Chad Basin tested a different model. Boko Haram turned villages into hostage camps and teenagers into weapons. The United States provided intelligence, training, and equipment mostly through the Pentagon, but the CIA did what it does: mapped the factions, tracked financial flows, and tried to anticipate splinters before they became new flags. Chad became an anchor. Niger became a runway. In 2018, major U.S. newspapers reported that the CIA had begun flying drones out of a remote airstrip in Niger's north, targeting ISIS militants in the Sahara's vastness. The Sahel became a new frontier in a war that was already old. Then Libya broke again. In 2011, a NATO intervention helped topple Gaddafi and released a decade's worth of unintended consequences. Weapons bled south into Mali, where a Tuareg uprising opened space for jihadists who raised banners and raised shrines. French troops led the counteroffensive. The United States supplied intelligence and refueling. The CIA focused on the glue that held the threat together: smugglers, clerics, ex-soldiers without paychecks, and men whose loyalty fit in a duffel bag. In 2012, an assault in Benghazi killed 4 Americans, including the U.S. ambassador. The attack catalyzed politics in Washington and recalibrations in the field. Libya became both a lesson and a warning. State collapse travels. If the post-9/11 years were about hunting networks, the 2010s and 2020s layered on a new concern: rivals with flags. Russia's Wagner Group mercenaries under state contract moved across the Central African Republic, Mali, Sudan, Libya, leaving security contracts and disinformation in their wake and taking gold, diamonds, and leverage. China poured money into ports and mines and roads through the Belt and Road Initiative, buying long leases on infrastructure and quietly purchasing influence that doesn't call itself that. The CIA's mandate did not become industrial policy, but it did become competition in the shadows, protecting U.S. equities, anticipating how authoritarian partners distort local politics, and resisting the conversion of debt into pressure. On the Red Sea, where traffic is wealth and wealth is power, quiet arrangements with Egypt, Sudan, Djibouti, and increasingly Kenya and Tanzania acquired a new urgency. The silent war had more players. Look long enough at the operations and you will see patterns of method, not just moments of drama. Recruitment is the foundation. A case officer in a dusty embassy cafeteria recognizes a logistics manager whose paycheck can't support his car, or a colonel whose resentment could kill him if he doesn't aim it carefully. The officer doesn't ask for secrets. He asks for stories. He builds a baseline, learns the life, tests the motives. Money, ego, ideology, revenge. He offers a cover for action, an excuse the source can live with. Engagements trickle into commitments. Commitments harden into tasks. Some of those tasks are information: where a shipment left, where it will arrive, who will sign for it, which truck's license plates should be noticed by a camera that never malfunctions. Others are interventions: persuade a minister not to sign a contract, delay a vote, get a cousin a job so the cousin stops drinking and starts listening. It isn't glamorous. It is the plumbing of power. Technical intelligence fills the gaps human beings can't. The agency partners with NSA, with friendly services, with contractors whose names appear in the news only when they collapse. Cell site simulators, internet metadata, satellite imagery that can count the trucks parked behind a fence on a cloudy day. These are not toys. They are the scaffolding without which the rest of the building falls. In Africa, where power lines end early and the sky is clear, satellites matter. So, Do people with motorcycles and time and patience. Signals get you the what, humans get you the why. Covert action is the phrase that never sounds like what it is. In one country, it means training a counter-terror unit whose members go home at night and tell their children they catch criminals for a living. In another, it means funneling money into a political party that agrees to pass a law that reduces a threat 2 years from now. In a third, it means precision. A car stops at a light, and a person inside that car never orders lunch. The CIA is not the Pentagon. War is not its business model. But there are moments when the cleanest line between a problem and a solution is a line drawn by a missile that never appears on a press release. In those moments, the debates shift from whether to how. Sovereignty, collateral, blowback, necessity. The lawyers aren't decorations. They are brakes. In the silent war, brakes are what keep you from rolling into a canyon. All of this lives under deniability, not because deniability is elegant, but because it makes survival possible. African governments are sensitive to pride and legitimacy. Their publics are more so. Partner can be grateful for help on Monday and condemn foreign interference on Tuesday. The skill is to let both be true without letting either become decisive. The failure is when secrecy becomes a habit that blinds you to risk. The CIA, like every service, has misread rooms, trusted the wrong officers, and paid for speed with clarity. In a business where you can be right for the wrong reasons and wrong for the right reasons, humility is not a virtue. It is armor. There are case studies that hold the light differently, forcing complex judgments instead of clean verdicts. In Sudan, where a hardline regime sheltered al-Qaeda in the 1990s and later waged scorched earth war in Darfur, the CIA developed lines to security chiefs who knew where the bodies were buried and where the flights landed from Afghanistan. Years later, as the United States sought to prevent terror attacks and manage chaos along the Nile, one of those security chiefs reportedly visited Langley. Critics asked if the war on terror excused anything. Practitioners replied that fewer names on a memorial is immoral, too. Both arguments survive, because both have truth. In Somalia, the 2006 decision to bankroll warlords against Islamist courts looks worse with every retelling, and yet some of those same warlords became the rough framework on which the Somali state rehung its fragile organs. In Nairobi and Addis Ababa, partners accused of brutal tactics produced intelligence that saved Western lives. In Niger, a quiet airstrip became a major drone base, and secrecy cloaked safety until drift and negligence produced accidents and tension. In Libya, a covert presence intended to help rescue diplomats turned tragic. The Central Intelligence Agency is not a machine that produces outcomes on demand. It is a system that manages risk in a landscape where risk is the only constant. Then there are the long games, the ones measured in decades, not months. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, cobalt and copper lace the soil of a state repeatedly broken by insurgencies, corruption, and interference. Chinese firms write contracts that look like lifelines and function like leashes. American policy asks for resilience, transparency, supply chains that don't depend on rivals' goodwill. The CIA's part in that puzzle is to know who is buying whom, and where the paper covers the true transactions. That isn't James Bond. It is a spreadsheet with consequences. In the Sahel, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, a wave of military coups in the 2020s shifted alliances toward Moscow's orbit. French forces departed. Russian operators arrived with promises and propaganda. Jihadists didn't leave. They adapted. The CIA watched a region pivot and tried to keep a thin thread of influence alive, relationships with officers who might one day run their countries and would rather not hand their capitals to foreigners with a fondness for gold mines. And censorship. These relationships are fragile because they depend on the one thing. Intelligence officers cannot control politics. Nothing about Africa is static. Mozambique's Cabo Delgado province exploded as an ISIS affiliate moved in among grievances and gas concessions. Rwanda sent troops, private firms, secured compounds. Washington designated the group and trained local forces. The CIA tracked the money and the ideology that moved with it. In the Red Sea, the Houthis in Yemen fired missiles. Shipping lanes shifted. East African states recalculated. In Kenya, the United States elevated security ties. In Ethiopia, a brutal civil war made partners into problems and problems into partners overnight. The silent war doesn't pause when the headlines change. It learns to walk and read at the same time. This is the point where a narrator is supposed to choose a judgment. Success or failure, triumph or shame. The truth is a ledger. On the credit side are plots that never matured, aircraft that never took off, bombs that never found a city, cells broken, militants captured, networks starved of cash and time, elections that didn't fall to disinformation, ports that didn't become bases, intelligence that moved a president to stop a crisis abroad before it landed at home. On the debt side are coups that found comfort instead of condemnation, units trained to protect civilians that sometimes abused them, allies who learned to cash checks without reforming, unintended consequences that grew like shadows as the sun moved. Secrecy maintained trust with partners and eroded it with publics. A drone saved a convoy and made a martyr. Relationships saved a city and corroded a country. The record is mixed because the record is human. So where does this leave the American viewer? Not in cynicism and not in worship. In understanding. The CIA in Africa is neither puppet master nor bystander. It is one actor among many, some more ruthless, some more generous, all looking for advantage in a place that knows how to turn strangers into fools. When it is at its best, the agency pairs craft with humility, remembering that the people who live on the ground know more than the people who fly in. When it is at its worst, it forgets that tomorrow exists and behaves as if the only thing that matters is the next cable home. The future of the silent war will be fought in the same kinds of rooms, by people you will never meet, against adversaries who do not wait for permission to change the rules. It will be fought with new tools, machine learning that combs through phone traffic, satellites the size of toasters, influence operations that move at the speed of outrage, and with old tools. Coffee, patience, the ability to listen until someone trusts you enough to tell you what will happen before it does. There is a final scene worth holding. A case officer in West Africa walks a city block she's walked 100 times and steps into a bookstore whose cash register is older than her father. The clerk nods. In the back, a man who works at a port you couldn't find on a blank map tells her that a ship with the wrong papers is due in 2 days. The ship will not dock, or if it does, someone will notice. No one will cheer. No one will know. A crisis will pass by like a storm that decided to turn. And in the ledger of work that matters, a line will be drawn that reads, "Nothing happened." In the end, that is the measure of a silent war. Not the noise it makes, but the quiet it preserves, and the discipline to remember that silence, used well, is not secrecy for its own sake. It is the space where better choices can be made before the world is forced to live with the worst ones.